The old courthouse clock showed 9:15 a.m. when David Johnson shuffled into courtroom number 3. His worn military jacket hung loose on his thin frame, and his boots had holes that let in the morning cold. The jacket was the only thing left from his army days, faded green with patches that told stories he tried not to remember. David sat in the wooden chair behind the defendant's table, his hands shaking just a little. Not from fear, but from sleeping outside for too many nights in a row. The courtroom was busy with people coming and going. Lawyers in expensive suits talked quietly to each other. Court workers carried stacks of papers from one desk to another. Other people waiting for their turn sat in the back rows, some looking worried, others just tired. Judge Helen Rodriguez walked in wearing her black robe. She had been doing this job for many years and had seen thousands of cases just like this. 1. She sat down behind the big wooden desk at the front of the room and opened a thick folder. Inside were the papers about David's case. To her, it looked like just another routine morning in court. The bailiff, a tall man with gray hair, called out in a loud voice, "The court will now hear the case of the state versus David Johnson, charges of trespassing and disturbing the peace." His voice echoed in the quiet room. David stood up slowly. Even after months of living on the streets, he still stood straight like a soldier. Old habits don't die easy, especially when they kept you alive in dangerous places far from home. His public defender, a young woman named Lisa Chen, barely looked up from her papers. She had 12 other cases to handle that morning, and this one seemed simple enough. The whole thing started 3 nights ago. David had been walking around downtown when the temperature dropped fast. Winter was coming early this year, and the wind cut through his jacket like it wasn't even there. He found a doorway outside Thompson's hardware store that blocked most of the wind. The store had been closed for hours, and the doorway was deep enough to keep him dry if it rained. David curled up in the corner and tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come easy anymore. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard sounds that took him back to places he didn't want to remember. The sound of helicopters, voices calling for help, the smell of smoke and dust. Around midnight, 2 police officers found him there. Officer Martinez and Officer Taylor were doing their regular patrol when they saw David in the doorway. They had dealt with homeless people before, and usually it was pretty straightforward. Ask them to move along, maybe give them information about the shelter if beds were available. But when they woke David up, something was different. He jumped up fast, his eyes wide and scared. For a moment, he wasn't in downtown Springfield anymore. In his mind, he was back in Afghanistan, and those voices weren't police officers. They were something else entirely. "Hey, buddy, you can't sleep here," Officer Martinez said in a calm voice. He had been a cop for 15 years and knew how to talk to people who were having a hard time. But David didn't hear a police officer. His mind was somewhere else, in a place where strangers calling out in the dark meant danger. He started backing away, talking to people who weren't there. "Rodriguez, get down. They're coming from the left," he shouted. "I need backup at the north wall." The officers tried to calm him down, but David was lost in memories that felt more real than the cold street. He wasn't trying to cause trouble. He was trying to save lives that had been lost years ago, in a desert on the other side of the world. When the episode passed and David came back to reality, he was sitting in the back of a police car. The officers were actually pretty kind about it. They could tell something was wrong, that this wasn't just another person causing problems. But they had a job to do and laws to enforce. Now, sitting in the courtroom, David tried to focus on what was happening. The prosecutor, a man in his 30s with a pressed suit and confident voice, was talking to the judge. He wanted David to pay a fine and serve the time he had already spent in jail. It was the standard punishment for cases like this. "Your Honor, the defendant was found trespassing on private property and became aggressive when asked to leave by police officers," the prosecutor said, reading from his notes. "We recommend time served plus a $200 fine." $200 might as well have been $2,000. David hadn't had that kind of money in months. His disability check from the Army was supposed to help, but it went to a bank account he couldn't access without an address. And you need an address to get an address. It was one of those problems that went in circles with no easy way out. Judge Rodriguez looked at the papers in front of her. She saw the charges, the arrest report, and David's record. What she saw was pretty typical. A veteran who had served his country, came home, and somehow ended up on the streets. It happened more often than most people realized. The courtroom was getting warm as more people came in for other cases. David felt sweat on his forehead, but his hands were still cold. He looked around at all the people in suits and wondered how he had ended up here. 5 years ago, he had been saving lives in a combat zone. Now he was being charged for trying to stay warm on a cold night. His public defender leaned over and whispered, "Just plead guilty and we can get this over with quickly. You'll probably get time served." She meant well, but she didn't really understand what this meant for David. Another mark on his record would make it even harder to find work, to get housing, to get back on his feet. The judge was about to call David forward when something made her pause. She looked at him more carefully, noticing things she had missed before. The way he sat straight despite everything. The military jacket that he wore with quiet pride. The way his eyes stayed alert, always watching, like someone who had learned to be ready for danger. She had seen a lot of veterans come through her courtroom over the years, some angry, some broken, some just lost. But there was something different about David Johnson, something that made her want to hear his story before making her decision. Judge Rodriguez picked up David's file and started reading more carefully than she usually did. What she found wasn't just another simple case. David Johnson had served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan as a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne Division. His military record showed 15 different medals and commendations, including some that weren't given out lightly. The prosecutor cleared his throat, wanting to move things along. He had 6 more cases to handle before lunch. But the judge held up her hand, asking for a moment to review the paperwork. She was looking at police reports, medical records, and witness statements that painted a picture of a man's life falling apart piece by piece. David sat quietly, his mind drifting back to how everything had started to go wrong. It wasn't sudden like an explosion. It was slow, like water dripping through a crack in the wall until the whole thing comes down. When he first came home from his last deployment, 2 years ago, everyone said he was a hero. There were handshakes and thank you for your service comments at the grocery store, but nobody really understood what he brought back with him. The nightmares started during his first week home. Every night he would wake up in a cold sweat, hearing voices of soldiers who didn't make it back. In Afghanistan, he had been the guy everyone counted on when things went bad. When someone got hurt, they called for Johnson. When the shooting started and men were bleeding, David was the one who ran toward the danger instead of away from it. He remembered Private Wilson, just 19 years old, who stepped on something he shouldn't have during a patrol. David worked on him for 40 minutes, trying everything he knew to keep the kid alive until the helicopter could get there. But sometimes, no matter how hard you try, it's not enough. Wilson died holding David's hand, asking him to tell his mom he wasn't scared. There were others too. Sergeant Phillips, who took shrapnel from a rocket attack and bled out before David could get the bleeding stopped. Corporal Davis, who was sitting right next to David when a sniper's bullet found its mark. For every soldier David saved, there was another one he couldn't save, and those faces visited him every night when he tried to sleep. His wife Rebecca tried to understand, but how do you explain to someone what it's like to lose friends in ways that civilians never see? She would find him sitting in the kitchen at 3 a.m. staring at nothing. When she asked what was wrong, David would just say he couldn't sleep. How could he tell her about the smell of blood and gunpowder that seemed to follow him? Everywhere, the drinking started as a way to quiet the voices in his head. Just a beer or two to help him relax. Then it became a 6-pack. Then whatever it took to make the memories stop coming. Rebecca tried to help, but David pushed her away. He told himself he was protecting her and their 2 kids from seeing him like this. But really, he was just scared that if they knew what he had become, they wouldn't love him anymore. Judge Rodriguez found the police report from 8 months ago. Rebecca had called them during one of David's bad episodes. She told the officer that David had been drinking and started yelling at people who weren't there. The kids were scared, and she didn't know what else to do. David wasn't violent toward his family, but he was fighting a war that had ended years ago, right there in their living room. The report said David was found outside their house, sitting on the front steps, crying and apologizing to soldiers who had died in his arms. When the police arrived, he begged them to let him go back and try to save his friends one more time. The officers were kind but firm. They took David to the hospital for evaluation and recommended he get help. But getting help isn't as easy as it sounds when you're dealing with the system. David tried to get into the VA program for veterans with PTSD, but there was a waiting list. 6 months, they said, maybe longer. In the meantime, his construction job became impossible to handle. The loud noises on the job site reminded him of gunfire. When a nail gun went off unexpectedly, David would hit the ground looking for cover that wasn't there. His boss, a good man named Frank who had hired David specifically because he was a veteran, tried to be patient. But when David started missing work because he couldn't get out of bed, or when he showed up smelling like alcohol, Frank had to make a business decision. He gave David 2 weeks' pay and a recommendation letter, but the job was gone. Without work, the bills started piling up. First, they missed the car payment. Then the credit cards got maxed out trying to keep up with rent and groceries. Rebecca picked up extra shifts at the diner where she worked, but it wasn't enough. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday morning, in March, giving them 30 days to pay what they owed or get out. David's pride was the last thing he had left, and it was killing him. His father had always taught him that a man takes care of his family no matter what. But here he was, watching his wife work double shifts while he sat at home, too messed up to hold down a job. The guilt was worse than the nightmares. The breaking point came when his 6-year-old daughter asked why Daddy was always sad. Rebecca and David had a long talk that night, and they both knew what had to happen. She took the kids to stay with her sister in another state, just until David could get the help he needed and get back on his feet. It was supposed to be temporary, but temporary became permanent when David couldn't afford the apartment by himself. He moved into a cheap motel, then into his truck when the motel money ran out. When the truck got repossessed, David found himself carrying everything he owned in a backpack, looking for a place to sleep every night. The streets were harder than anything he had faced in the military. At least in Afghanistan, he had a purpose and people counting on him. On the streets, he was invisible. People walked past him like he wasn't even there. The same society that had called him a hero 2 years ago now crossed the street to avoid him. Judge Rodriguez finished reading the file and looked up at David with new understanding. This wasn't just another homeless case. This was a man who had given everything for his country and was now paying the price for carrying burdens that no one should have to carry alone. Judge Rodriguez closed the file and looked directly at David. Something about his case felt different from all the others she had seen that morning. She had been on the bench for 15 years, and usually she could predict how these cases would go. But David's military record was impressive, and the circumstances of his arrest seemed more complicated than a simple trespassing charge. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice softer than it had been all morning, "before I make my decision, I'd like you to state your full name and military service record for the court." This wasn't something she normally asked, but something was nagging at her like trying to remember a song you heard on the radio. David stood up straighter, and for a moment the tired homeless man disappeared. In his place stood a soldier. His voice was clear and strong as he spoke. "Staff Sergeant David Michael Johnson, United States Army, 82nd Airborne Division, combat medic, ma'am." The courtroom got a little quieter. Even the lawyers who had been whispering stopped to listen. There was something about the way David said those words that commanded respect. This wasn't just someone reading from a script. This was a man stating who he was and who he had been when it mattered most. Judge Rodriguez felt a strange chill run down her spine. The 82nd Airborne, combat medic. Something about those words struck a chord in her memory, but she couldn't quite place it. She looked down at his file again, checking the dates of his service. "Staff Sergeant Johnson," she continued, "can you tell me your service dates and where you were deployed?" David's eyes focused on something beyond the courtroom. "For 3 deployments to Afghanistan, ma'am. First tour was 2019 to 2020, second was 2021, and my final deployment was 2022 to early 2023. I served at various forward operating bases throughout Kandahar and Helmand provinces." The judge's pen stopped moving across her notepad. Those dates, those places, they meant something to her. Her heart started beating a little faster as pieces of a puzzle began fitting together in her mind. She had heard these details before, not in a courtroom but around her dinner table at home. "Staff Sergeant Johnson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Were you ever stationed at Forward Operating Base Lightning in Helmand Province during the summer of 2022? David's eyes widened slightly. FOB Lightning wasn't a big base that everyone knew about. It was a small outpost that most people back home had never heard of. The fact that this judge knew about it was strange and unexpected. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, confusion clear in his voice. "I was there from June through September 2022. May I ask how you know about FOB Lightning?" The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, sensing that something important was happening. Judge Rodriguez set down her papers entirely and looked directly at David with an expression that had changed from professional distance to personal interest. "Staff Sergeant Johnson," she said, and her voice was starting to shake just a little. "My son, Lieutenant Kevin Rodriguez, was stationed at FOB Lightning during that same time period. He was a platoon leader with Bravo Company." David's face went pale. "Lieutenant Rodriguez." The name hit him like a physical blow, bringing back memories he had tried so hard to bury. The young officer with the quick smile and the habit of checking on his men every morning. The lieutenant who cared more about his soldiers than his own safety. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," David said quietly, almost to himself. "Kevin Rodriguez from Texas. He always talked about his mom, who was a judge back home." Judge Rodriguez had to steady herself against her desk. Her son Kevin had been killed in action 6 months ago, just 2 weeks before he was supposed to come home. She had been trying to hold herself together ever since, throwing herself into her work to avoid thinking about the empty chair at her dinner table. "Staff Sergeant Johnson," she said, her professional composure beginning to crack. "My son wrote to me about a medic who saved several lives during an attack on your base. He said this medic crawled through enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers. He said the medic's name was Johnson." The memory came flooding back to David like a dam breaking. August 15th, 2022. It had been a quiet morning until the mortars started falling. The attack came from 3 directions at once, and within minutes, half a dozen soldiers were down and calling for help. David remembered running, from position to position, trying to get to everyone who needed help. The shooting was so intense that moving between cover points meant taking your life in your hands. But that's what combat medics do. They go where the wounded are, no matter how dangerous it is. Lieutenant Rodriguez had been hit while trying to get his men to safety. Shrapnel from a mortar round had torn through his leg and he was losing blood fast. David found him behind a concrete barrier, still trying to radio for support, even though he was badly hurt. "I need to get you out of here, sir," David had told him, but the lieutenant grabbed his arm. "Take care of my guys first, Doc," Kevin had said. "I can wait." But David knew he couldn't wait. The lieutenant was going into shock, and without immediate treatment, he would bleed out in minutes. David worked on him right there under fire, stopping the bleeding and getting an IV started while bullets flew overhead. When the medevac helicopter finally arrived, David made sure Lieutenant Rodriguez was on it. The last thing Kevin said before they loaded him onto the aircraft was, "Tell my mom I was thinking about her." Judge Rodriguez wiped tears from her eyes as she watched David's face change with the memory. She could see that he remembered her. Son remembered that terrible day when everything went wrong. "Staff Sergeant Johnson," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My son lived for 3 more months after that attack. He was able to come home to hug me one more time, to tell me he loved me. The doctor said if it hadn't been for the quick treatment he received from his unit's medic, he never would have made it to the hospital." The courtroom was completely still. Everyone could feel the weight of what was happening. even if they didn't understand all the details. A homeless veteran and a judge were sharing a moment that went far beyond anything that usually happened in court. David's hands were shaking now, not from cold or fear, but from emotion. Lieutenant Rodriguez was a good officer, ma'am. He cared about his soldiers. I just did what any medic would do. No, Judge Rodriguez said firmly, standing up behind her desk. What you did was heroic. You saved my son's life, and you gave our family 3 more precious months with him before God called him home. Judge Rodriguez stood slowly behind her desk, her hands gripping the edge to steady herself. The formal atmosphere of the courtroom had completely changed. This wasn't just another case anymore. This was personal, and everyone in the room could feel it. Staff Sergeant Johnson, she said, her voice carrying a weight that made everyone lean forward to listen. I need to tell you something that I think you deserve to know. She paused, collecting her thoughts and her emotions. My son, Kevin, came home from that deployment and he spent hours telling me about the brave medics who risked their lives to save others. David stood perfectly still, but inside his mind was racing. He remembered Lieutenant Rodriguez talking about home, about his mother who worked in the justice system. The young officer used to show pictures of family barbecues and birthday parties. He talked about how proud his mom was of his service and how she worried about him every single day. Judge Rodriguez continued, her professional mask completely gone now. Kevin told me about a day in August when everything went wrong at your base. He said the attack was the worst they had experienced during the entire deployment. He described how a medic ran through gunfire, going from soldier to soldier, saving lives while bullets were flying everywhere. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear people breathing. The prosecutor had forgotten about his other cases. The public defender had put down her files. Even the bailiff, who had seen everything in his 20 years of court service, was listening, with complete attention. He told me about lying behind that concrete wall watching his life bleed out onto the ground. The judge said, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. He said he was ready to die, that he had made peace with it. But then this medic appeared, crawling on his belly through the dirt and the gunfire, refusing to leave him behind. David's own eyes were getting wet now. He remembered that day so clearly. The sound of the mortars hitting the base, the screaming and shouting as soldiers called for help. The way Lieutenant Rodriguez had looked at him, not with fear, but with gratitude, even though he was badly hurt. Kevin described how you worked on him right there in the middle of the battle. Judge Rodriguez continued. He said you were completely calm, like the explosions and gunfire were just background noise. You started an IV, stopped the bleeding, and kept talking to him the whole time, telling him he was going to be okay. The memory was so vivid for David. He could still smell the smoke and dust. He could still hear the helicopters coming in for the wounded. But most of all, he remembered the look in the young lieutenant's eyes when he realized he was going to live. My son lived for 3 more months after that attack, the judge said, her voice breaking. 3 months where he got to come home, where he got to hug his family, where he got to tell us how much he loved us. The doctors at the military hospital said that without the immediate care he received in the field, he never would have survived the flight to Germany. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss. Lieutenant Rodriguez was one of the good ones. He really cared about his soldiers. He cared about you too, Judge Rodriguez replied. In his last letter home, just a week before the accident that took him from us, he wrote about the medics in his unit. He said they were the bravest people he had ever met, because they ran toward danger when everyone else was running away. The accident. David remembered hearing about it. Lieutenant Rodriguez had been leading a convoy back to base when their vehicle hit an explosive device. It was supposed to be a routine supply run, the kind they had done dozens of times before. But in war, nothing is ever really routine. Judge Rodriguez reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn from being read many times, and David could see it was a letter written in neat handwriting. This is the last letter Kevin sent home, she said. He wrote it the day before he died. Would you like me to read what he said about the medics in his unit? David nodded, not trusting his voice to speak. Judge Rodriguez unfolded the letter carefully and found the passage she was looking for. He wrote, Mom, I want you to know that if something happens to me over here, I'm surrounded by heroes. Our medics are incredible people who put their lives on the line every day to save others. There's one medic, Staff Sergeant Johnson, who has saved more lives than I can count. He's the kind of person who makes you proud to serve alongside him. The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of people quietly crying. Even the tough prosecutor was wiping his eyes, and the bailiff had to turn away to compose himself. Kevin wrote that he hoped someday he could introduce me to the medics who served with him. Judge Rodriguez continued. He wanted me to thank them personally for their service and their sacrifice. He never got the chance to make those introductions, but today fate has brought one of those heroes right here to my courtroom. David was overwhelmed. For months he had felt like a failure, like someone who had lost everything and let everyone down. The voices in his head told him he was worthless, that he was just another broken veteran who couldn't handle civilian life. But hearing these words, knowing that Lieutenant Rodriguez had thought of him as a hero, changed something deep inside him. Staff Sergeant Johnson, Judge Rodriguez said, her voice strong again despite her tears. I want everyone in this courtroom to understand who you are. You hold the Bronze Star Medal with Valor Device for heroic action in combat. You have the Purple Heart for wounds received in action. You have the Combat Medical Badge, which is only awarded to medics who provide medical aid under enemy fire. She picked up David's military file and continued reading. Your record shows that you personally saved the lives of 23 wounded soldiers during your 3 deployments. 23 mothers got their sons back home because of your courage and skill. The prosecutor stood up, something highly unusual during proceedings like this. Your Honor, I move to dismiss all charges against Staff Sergeant Johnson immediately. Motion granted, Judge Rodriguez said without hesitation. All charges are dismissed with prejudice. But she wasn't finished. Furthermore, she announced to the entire courtroom, I am personally going to make sure that this American hero gets the support and services he has earned through his sacrifice for our nation. David stood there, overwhelmed by emotions he hadn't felt in months. For the first time since he had been living on the streets, someone saw him not as a problem to be solved, but as a person with dignity and worth. What happened next had never occurred in Judge Rodriguez's courtroom, or perhaps any courtroom in the entire county. The emotional weight of the moment hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Everyone could feel that something special was happening, something that would be remembered long after the court session ended. In the back row, an elderly court reporter named Betty Williams had been taking notes for 35 years. She had seen thousands of cases, from minor traffic violations to serious criminal trials, but she had never heard a story like this one. As Judge Rodriguez finished speaking about David's military service, Betty slowly stood up from her chair. Her movement was quiet at first, barely noticeable in the emotional atmosphere of the courtroom. But then Bailiff Thompson, a former Marine, himself who had served in the First Gulf War, noticed Betty standing. Without thinking, he straightened up and came to attention, his military training taking over. The prosecutor, who just minutes before had been ready to send David back to the streets with a fine he couldn't pay, looked around and saw people standing. Something stirred in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a child saying the Pledge of Allegiance in school. He rose from his chair, his expensive suit suddenly feeling less important than the moment he was witnessing. One by one, like ripples spreading across a pond, every person in the courtroom began to stand. Defense attorneys paused their whispered conversations with clients. Court clerks set aside their paperwork. Other defendants waiting for their cases forgot about their own troubles for a moment and focused on the homeless veteran standing before the judge. David looked around in complete bewilderment. For months he had been invisible to the world. People crossed the street to avoid him. Store owners asked him to move along when he sat too close to their businesses. Children stared at him like he was something to be afraid of. He had become used to being treated like he didn't matter, like his life had no value, but now in this moment everyone was standing for him. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. because they understood, even if just for a few minutes, that the man in the worn military jacket had given everything for his country and deserved better than what life had given him in return. Judge Rodriguez felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her courtroom transform. In 15 years on the bench, she had maintained strict professional boundaries. She had never let her personal feelings interfere with her duty to the law. But this was different. This was about honoring someone who had honored his country with his service. She stepped down from behind her elevated desk, something she had never done in all her years as a judge. The black robe that represented her authority suddenly seemed less important than simply being a human being connecting with another human being. As she walked toward David, the applause began. It started softly, almost hesitantly, but quickly grew into something powerful and genuine. The sound filled the courtroom and spilled out into the hallway, where other court workers stopped what they were doing to see what was happening. David stood frozen in place, overwhelmed by emotions he hadn't felt since his military service. In Afghanistan, when missions went well and everyone came home safe, there was a special bond between soldiers, a recognition that they had looked out for each other in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. That's what this felt like, but bigger and more unexpected. His public defender, Lisa Chen, was crying openly now. She had defended hundreds of homeless clients over the years, most of whom were processed through the system like paperwork. But David's story reminded her why she had gone into public service in the first place: to help people who needed someone to fight for them. Judge Rodriguez reached David and extended her hand. When they shook hands, she pulled him slightly closer and spoke in a voice only he could hear. "Thank you for bringing my son home to me. Thank you for giving our family those last precious months with Kevin." David's voice was barely a whisper when he replied, "Your son was a good man, ma'am. He would be proud of what you did here today." The applause continued, and Judge Rodriguez turned to address the entire courtroom. Her voice carried clearly over the clapping, reaching every person in the room. "Let this be a reminder to all of us," she said, "that we never know who we might encounter in our daily lives. The person asking for spare change might be someone who once saved lives in combat. The homeless veteran sleeping in a doorway might be a decorated hero who gave everything for our freedom." She paused, looking directly at David before continuing. "Staff Sergeant Johnson, this court owes you an apology. Our community owes you an apology, and I personally owe you a debt that I can never fully repay." The judge then made an announcement that surprised everyone, including herself. "I am personally going to contact the Veterans Administration today to ensure that Staff Sergeant Johnson receives immediate access to all the benefits and services he has earned. I am also going to reach out to local veterans organizations to help him find housing and employment." But she wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I am establishing a fund in my son's memory to help other homeless veterans in our community. Because if we can honor our veterans with parades and speeches, we can certainly honor them with the support they need to rebuild their lives." The applause grew even louder. People who had never spoken to each other before were sharing tissues and exchanging looks of understanding. The formal barriers of the courtroom had broken down, replaced by something more fundamental and human. David wiped his eyes and managed to speak loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you all. I haven't felt this much hope in a very long time." As the applause finally began to die down, Judge Rodriguez made one final statement. "Court is adjourned, but before everyone leaves, I want to say something. We all witnessed something special here today. We saw what happens when we look past appearances and recognize the dignity in every human being. Let's carry that lesson with us when we leave this courtroom." The aftermath of that day changed many lives. David got the help he needed for his PTSD and found stable housing within a month. The story spread throughout the community, leading to increased support for local homeless veterans. Judge Rodriguez's fund raised over $50,000 in its first year. But perhaps most importantly, everyone who was in that courtroom that day remembered the moment when a homeless veteran was recognized for who he really was. A hero who had served his country with honor and deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. David later said that the standing ovation didn't just change his circumstances. It changed how he saw himself. For the first time in months, he remembered that he was more than his current situation. He was a combat medic who had saved lives, a soldier who had served with honor, and a human being worthy of respect and support. The courtroom returned to normal the next day, but the people who were there would never forget the morning when justice meant more than just following the law. It meant recognizing the humanity in everyone who appeared before the bench.